Hello and welcome to Euronews Tonight. Let's take a look at the latest headlines. Jens Stoltenberg says significant differences remain between NATO allies and Russia over Ukraine. The US says Moscow needs to choose de-escalation and diplomacy.
Mr. Speaker, I want to apologise.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson says sorry as he finally admits attending a party in Downing Street while the country was in lockdown. The opposition tells him to go.
Is he now going to do the decent thing and resign?
A New York judge rejects Prince Andrew's attempt to have Virginia Giuffre's sexual abuse civil case against him thrown out.
And Novak Djokovic faces fresh questions over his conduct as Australia mulls cancelling his visa for a second time.
Hello and welcome to the programme. NATO says there are still significant differences between its allies and Russia over Ukraine. The security alliance has been holding talks with Russia in Brussels today amid growing concern over the increasing numbers of troops along Ukraine's eastern border. The US is concerned Russia is preparing to invade. NATO's Secretary General says the alliance had a very serious and direct exchange about the situation in Ukraine and its implications on European security.
NATO allies are clear-eyed about the prospects for progress in these talks. They expressed serious concern about the Russian military build-up in and around Ukraine and called on Russia to immediately de-escalate the situation and to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighbours.
For more on this, let's head over to Brussels to speak to Shona Murray. Shona, so both sides are still very apart in terms of reaching common ground over the Ukraine crisis. What are the core issues?
Well, this is described as a single item agenda at NATO, and you can understand why, given the very consequential nature of what was being discussed between Russia and NATO members. And essentially, that was the threat of an invasion by Russia of Ukraine. On a broader perspective, there was a discussion about the European security apparatus and the demands from Russia, namely that it close the door on its open membership policy, essentially close the door on membership of NATO for Ukraine and other ex-Soviet countries. And those demands from Russia have been described as a non-starter widely by NATO, by the US, by Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO. So that's essentially what was really on discussion, although the NATO did say that they would like to discuss areas of cooperation with Putin if this diplomatic efforts do come to pass and Russia decides not to invade Ukraine. What was interesting is that when you speak to NATO sources and when we spoke to people like Undersecretary Wendy Sherman for the US or Jens Stoltenberg, nobody really seems any the wiser as to whether Vladimir Putin has made up his mind as to whether he will or had any intention to invade Ukraine. And as you mentioned there, we heard from Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, that no significant progress has been made yet.
The US Deputy Secretary of State has spoken to Euronews and she appears to have put the ball into Russia's court. So when it comes to dialing back tensions with Ukraine, what else did she tell you?
Yeah, so the expectations for today and this week were essentially low in that there wasn't any hope that Vladimir Putin would suddenly de-escalate and remove the 100,000 troops from the Ukrainian border, but that there would be a discussion around diplomacy and that Putin may eventually decide to take that path. What we heard from US Undersecretary Wendy Sherman, who spoke to our colleague Maeve McMahon, was that she's sort of dismissing the Russian proposition, which is that it is somehow threatened by Ukraine, Russia being a Security Council member, having vast energy resources, having vast geographical landmass. And she also made the point that, diplomacy, if it turns out that Vladimir Putin does decide to invade Ukraine, diplomacy won't be at fault. It'll be Vladimir Putin's decision to take this action.
Anything is possible in the world. But I will say this, it won't be about diplomacy failing. It will be about President Putin having made a choice that actually I think will bring great, great sorrow to his countrymen and women, because there will be great economic costs to Russia if they take this action. I think he knows that. There's enormous solidarity he will have heard this week, so he will know that we will be unified in imposing costs. If he makes the wrong choice, I hope he makes the right one.
US Undersecretary Wendy Sherman there speaking to our colleague Maeve Manhattan, making the point that there will be grave economic consequences on Russia if Vladimir Putin is to take that decision to invade Ukraine. Rube?
Thanks for bringing us up to date, Shona. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has apologised for attending a social event during the height of the country's COVID-19 lockdown. He told MPs in Parliament that while he was there, he believed the gathering was a work event and that he only attended for 25 minutes. While the Prime Minister said he takes responsibility for the event, he maintains the party was technically within government guidance.
I want to apologise. I know that millions of people across this country have made extraordinary sacrifices over the last 18 months. I know the anguish that they have been through, unable to mourn their relatives, unable to live their lives as they want or to do the things they love. And I know the rage they feel with me and with the government I lead when they think that in Downing Street itself the rules are not being properly followed by the people who make the rules.
But the Prime Minister's answers over his attendance at the party were met with disbelief and anger by opposition MPs. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said Johnson's excuses were ridiculous and were offensive to the public, calling for him to step down.
Well, there we have it. After months of deceit and deception, the pathetic spectacle of a man who's run out of road. His defence that he didn't realise he was at a party. It is so ridiculous that it's actually offensive to the British public. He's finally been forced to admit what everyone knew, that when the whole country was locked down, he was hosting boozy parties in Downing Street. Yes. Is he now going to do the decent thing and resign?
Well, for more on this, I'm joined by Victoria Smith, who's outside Downing Street for us. Victoria, the Prime Minister has finally admitted that he was at the party. But is his apology too little too late?
Evening, Rue. Well, just 2 days ago, if you remember, the Prime Minister was refusing to answer questions about whether he'd been at this so-called party or not. And now we have not only that, we have an apology, an admission that he was there. He says he takes full responsibility for the gathering. He admits he should have brought his people back inside 10 Downing Street. And he says he regrets what's happened, but he is still sticking to this defence that he considered it to be a work event. We wait to hear from this inquiry by the senior civil servant, Sue Gray, whether she thinks that's the case. But certainly in the House this afternoon, there were fierce calls for his resignation. In fact, he faced 8 calls to resign at Prime Minister's questions today. And it's not just in the House, it's out among the public in the UK. There are some furious reactions from people who'd perhaps stuck to the rules back in May 2020, who were unable to visit loved ones who may have died since then. We've heard from one woman, Hannah Brady, who runs a COVID-19 bereaved family support group. She said that, in fact, her father died just a few days before this so-called party took place, and that his death certificate was being signed on the day of this so-called party. And she went on to say that she actually met with Boris Johnson here at Downing Street, in the garden behind 10 Downing Street, and he looked her in the eye, she says, and said that he had done all he could for people like her father. So what does he do now? Does he stick to his guns? Does he resign? He could potentially face a vote of no confidence in the coming days or weeks if enough MPs demand that. He could resign, although it looks as if he's going to stick to his guns and wait for the inquiry to make its decision. Or he could try and stick it out. He could try and steer the public away from this issue back towards COVID, the vaccination programme, or perhaps the cost of living issue, which will be the next big hurdle for the Prime Minister to overcome.
Boris Johnson's approval ratings are at an all-time low, but it's the support of his party that he genuinely needs to see this through. What are Tory MPs saying?
Yeah, that is the crucial issue. It doesn't really matter to him so much what the public thinks. It matters what his party, what his supporters think, the Tory faithful, the Tory unfaithful. So interestingly today, the 1922 committee were meeting. We hear reports that Boris Johnson actually went and informally met some of them, perhaps to see which way the wind was blowing, to garner their support or not. But this 1922 committee is really crucial to this, because they are the committee that consider any calls for him to face a vote of no confidence. It would take 54 MPs to demand that, and the 1922 committee would look at that, as they have done with previous prime ministers like Theresa May, to make a decision on whether he should face a call of no confidence. Otherwise, it looks as if he may well wait for this inquiry. We don't know yet how long it will take. It could be next week. It could be a few weeks after that. We wait to see. Meanwhile, all quiet here at number 10 tonight, and certainly no noise coming from the gardens, no parties going on behind number 10 as far as I can make out.
Thank you, Victoria. Joining me now from London is Alistair Campbell, a writer and strategist who was Director of Communications for former Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair. Thank you for joining us. So Boris Johnson has finally admitted he was at the party and offered an apology. Does this go near enough to see him through this crisis?
Well, it shouldn't, because just be clear what it means, what happened today. He stood up in the House of Commons and admitted, finally, it having been dragged from him over weeks, he admitted that he broke the law, and he admitted that he was in breach of his own ministerial code. That is a resigning offence. Now, he won't resign. Boris Johnson is somebody who his entire life has made rules for others and never felt that they applied to him. He's a liar, he's a charlatan, he's somebody without a moral compass, and people were warned of that. People knew that when he was elected, and this to me is the inevitable consequence of what happens when you put in power somebody of the amorality of Boris Johnson. So certainly for me, it hasn't done enough, and I don't think he should ever have got the job, but he did. The British people elected him. But I think an awful lot of people, the feelings about Boris Johnson have turned to absolute, complete disgust and contempt. And I think a lot of people in the country now feel that.
The Prime Minister is calling on MPs to wait for the result of Sue Gray's investigation before making a judgment. And he's gambling a lot on what she'll say, surely.
Well, I know Sue Gray very well from the time when I worked in Downing Street. She's a very, very strong and professional woman. She's a very committed public servant. But I think he has put her in a completely invidious position, because for a civil servant now to be sitting in judgment, effectively, whether the Prime Minister should stay in office, that is utterly unacceptable in my view. Now, I think she'll do a good job. I think she'll probably get to the truth. But that is a very, very, very difficult position to put somebody into. I absolutely believe now that the Metropolitan Police, they should be looking into this now. They have been saying they don't have any evidence to investigate. Well, they've now got an invitation to a party at a time when their officers were going around London arresting people who were meeting each other outside in groups of more than two. I mean, it could not be clearer. And for him to pretend that he thought this was a work event, he really does seem to think that the British people are totally stupid.
Today was the first time that Sir Keir Starmer called for the Prime Minister's resignation, despite a series of scandals. Why has he waited so long?
Well, I think you've got to be very careful in calling for people's resignation, because there's always a danger when you do. And your correspondent earlier was talking about a motion of no confidence. If, for example, Labour were to put down a motion of no confidence, it might unite the Conservatives. But I think that what Keir Starmer did there it's the inevitable consequence of where we are. He does have to resign. You cannot stay in office when you have broken the law and you've broken the ministerial code so clearly. Now, as it happens, I think Johnson's broken the ministerial code many times before, because he has lied in Parliament before, and that is meant to be a resigning offence. But I think what we're seeing here, I thought Keir Starmer today was absolutely skewered Johnson. He didn't go over the top. He was very forensic. He was very fact-based. He was very calm. And Johnson did what he always does, which is sit there shaking his head and pretending that somebody's talking about a different planet, as if he's had nothing to do with what was going on. And by the way, you say he apologised. He didn't apologise, in effect. What he said was that he was very, very sorry. that mistakes were made. He didn't say, I made the mistakes. And apparently he's been talking to Tory MPs tonight and telling them he hopes that they support him because he's actually standing up for other people who made the mistake. He is the Prime Minister. I've worked in Downing Street for many, many years. There is no way in the world that a senior civil servant would send out invitations to a party in the garden at the height of a pandemic, when at the same time in the building there is a cabinet minister doing a press conference telling the country they can't go out. There is no way that happens without the Prime Minister giving the go-ahead. Absolutely no way. And if it is happening inside, it means he has no control and no authority. So either way, I just think eventually, look, he's a dead man walking now. It actually might suit the Labour Party for him to just sort of, limp on. But I go back to my basic point. The guy is a liar and a charlatan. He should never have been near serious public office ever. And we're now reaping the consequences of the fact that happened.
Alistair Campbell, thank you very much for speaking to Euronews. The British royal Prince Andrew will face a civil lawsuit in the United States over allegations he sexually assaulted an underage girl. A New York judge has rejected his lawyer's attempts to have the case thrown out. Virginia Giuffre is taking the prince to court over accusations he abused her when she was 17 years old. She says she was trafficked by the late convicted paedophile Jeffrey Epstein, a friend of the prince. Novak Djokovic has admitted he made an error in judgment by meeting a journalist after knowingly testing positive for coronavirus. The Serbian player is facing fresh questions about his movements before he flew to Australia last week. Authorities are still debating whether to cancel his visa for a second time over the controversy. Matthew in the Cube has more.
Ru, this whole affair has been described as a circus. Novak Djokovic has released a fresh statement on Instagram after court documents this week revealed it was a positive coronavirus test that allowed him to obtain a visa and travel to Australia. Djokovic said he had taken this test on the 14th of December after attending a basketball game in Serbia. 3 days later, he was pictured not wearing a face mask alongside a number of young Serbian tennis players. But Djokovic says it was only after this event that he was told he had tested positive for the coronavirus, and he then made an effort to cancel nearly all of his remaining commitments. But Djokovic has admitted that he made an error in judgment in violating Serbian rules and leaving isolation for one commitment. On the 18th of December, he met with the French newspaper L'Equipe for an interview and photo shoot. And again, as you can see, he briefly removed his face mask. Now, Djokovic said he felt obliged to continue and commit to this long-standing meeting, but he has since acknowledged his error and says that he should have cancelled this meeting at the time, having known he was positive for COVID-19. At the same time, Djokovic in that Instagram post has also addressed questions about his travel documents when he failed to testify that he had travelled to Spain in the 2 weeks before he left for Australia. He says in this post that that was a human error by one of his team, and certainly something that was not deliberate. So Djokovic admitting these kind of lapses, but at the same time he says he is still the subject of a lot of very hurtful misinformation and is trying to alleviate any concern about his presence in Australia. It's of course worth noting that Djokovic could still face potential deportation, and Australia's immigration minister has said he's considering using these discretionary powers if it is in the interests of health and safety to cancel Djokovic's visa for a second time. Djokovic's team are still submitting a number of documents to try and support his case, but at least for the time being, his participation in the upcoming Australian Open remains in doubt as he is seeking a record 21st Grand Slam title.
Thank you, Matthew. After the death of the European Parliament's President, David Sassoli, eyes have turned towards who will be next to take on the role. Some candidates are calling to strengthen the role of the Parliament as a check against the European Commission and Council. Alberto De Filippis reports.
The death of European Parliament President David Sassoli has shocked many, but for most European lawmakers, the show must go on. The late Italian was due to step down from his position next week, which will still go ahead as planned. A vote will take place during next week's monthly meeting of MEPs in Strasbourg to choose Sassoli's successors.
El Parlamento Europeo en enero llega
The European Parliament in January reaches the halfway point of the legislature. As a result, it has to renew its positions once again. That's why next week in Strasbourg the Parliament will, and had to anyway, choose the person to replace David, and at the same time all the vice presidents of the institutions, and then later also the MEPs who will sit on the Parliament's committees. First Vice President, Roberta Metsola, is temporary, replacing Sassoli, but she is also the candidate in pole position to replace him. But there are others with slim possibilities, like the Greens' Alice Bah-Kuhnke. She believes the European Parliament needs to be put center stage.
We need to sit down with representatives from the Commission and the Council and make sure that they understand that we don't accept to be put aside and not being part in forming the future for the EU citizens.
Also in the race are Sira Riego from the far-left group and Cosma Zlotowski from the Conservatives and Reformists group. For Euronews from Brussels, Alberto De Filippis.
The war in Iraq has long prevented archaeologists from discovering the country's hidden past. But one team are back on a mission to unearth its rich cultural history, as Mark Armstrong reports.
After years of absence due to military conflict, members of a French-Iraqi archaeological expedition are back in southern Iraq. The province of Daikar is known for its richness in ancient cultural treasures, in particular the site of the Sumerian city of Larsa.
Here we are at the site of Larsa in southern Iraq, which is a few kilometres from the present city of Nasiriyah. Larsa is one of the largest sites in Iraq, since according to the latest measurements that the mission has just carried out, it covers more than 200 hectares. To give you an idea, it is the same size as Paris at the time of Philip Augustus.
We have found clues that suggest a church may be buried under this site. And there could be a shrine.
Archaeologists say Larsa is a paradise for exploring ancient Mesopotamia, which hosted, among others, the Empire of Akkad, the Babylonians and Alexander the Great.
That's all from Euronews tonight, but do stay tuned for more news coming up.